mind if I sit down?
Yeah.
If I stand up, it makes me really tall. A bit scary. So, now, have any of you seen bats flying around in your garden before? You have, yeah? And they're quite good flyers, aren't they, at night? Yeah? For those of you that haven't seen bats, they fly around at night and they fly around at little ballet dancers through the air, catching all the bugs in the air. So, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about bats and ask you some questions, and then if you have any answers, you can put your hand up and we'll see if you get any answers right. Okay? So, now, I think bats are brilliant. And bats are brilliant because they're the only mammal, so they're the only animal that's in the similar sort of area as us that can fly. Now you have birds that fly and you have insects that fly, but bats are really special because what they've done is they've taken their hand, a bit like ours, and they've grown the fingers really long, and then what's happened is they've got this skin that goes between all of those fingers, all the way down to their ankles, between their ankles, and all the way out the other side, and that makes one big area that they can use to fly. And then they flap really hard and they can fly through the air. And they're very, very good flyers. They can fly really fast. They can fly up to 30 miles an hour. So they can go as fast as a car, some of them. So they are very speedy. And now the name that scientists give bats, it's a very tricky word, I even struggle to say it, is Chiroptera. And what that actually means is hand wing. So it literally means they turn their hand into a wing. Now, bats are really, really old. We know that bats were around when the dinosaurs were around. So we know that they've been around a very long time. And bats, as I said, they're mammals. Do they know the term mammal?
We've started talking about mammals, haven't we? We know a few mammals, so we were a bit curious about a bat. Because
yeah, so bats are mammals, and that means that they have warm bodies like us. So they use all the food they eat to make their bodies nice and warm. But they also have a really special trick. So bats sometimes live in very hot areas or very cold areas. And what they do with their bodies is they can make their body match the temperature around them. So if it's a really cold night, they actually drop their body temperature so that their bodies are cold. And if it's really warm, they make their bodies really warm. And that means they don't have to burn as much of their food off, trying to keep themselves nice and toasty. They also have furry bodies. So now we're mammals, but our fur's turned into very boring fur. We've got hardly any hair. Have any of you got very hairy arms? You're a bit more furry than the others? Yeah, you've got furrier arms, but that's good. Keeps you warm in winter, but a bit like cats and dogs, bats have very furry bodies, and that helps keep them warm as well. And bats also have, they have babies, and their babies come out looking like mini bats. So they don't lay eggs. Some people think they lay eggs, and that's the bat chattering over there. She's singing to you. And this picture here, you can see this bat has had a baby, and this is the baby here. It's not got its fur yet, so it's a little bit like a baby mouse where they've got no fur. And it comes out with all its wings and everything, all ready to go. And they grow really, really quickly, so they feed on milk, and then within 6 weeks, that little baby bat will be able to fly. So when you go on your summer holidays, yeah, that bat's born. And when you come back from your summer holidays, that bat's flying around in your gardens. So it's quite a clever thing to do. Now, I did have one question actually that I forgot to ask you. How many babies do you think a bat has? 4 to 7, okay. And you want it? 2. And one more from... 1. There we go. They have one baby a year, and that's it. So some people think bats, because they're small like mice, and mice have lots and lots of babies, some people think that bats also have lots of babies, and they don't. They only have one baby a year, and maybe only one every 2 years. So If anything happens to those bats, then it takes them a long time to have enough babies to make their populations big again. So, now, back to the old lady. Again, some people think that because bats are small like mice, and how long does a mouse normally live? About 7 months, that's a very good guess. Yes, so they only live about half a year. How long do we think a bat lives for? At the back?
A year?
A year, okay, good guess.
12 months?
12 months, that's very close to a year. Another good guess. And
10 years?
oh, now that's much closer. So bats will live for about 20 to 30 years. So by the time you're 30 years old, if a bat was born this summer, by the time you're 30, that bat's probably still flying around. So they live a very long time as well. So that's something we have to think of in my sort of job, where I look after bats and how to make sure that they're okay in the world. We have to think about how long they're going to live. Yeah. So, bats around the world. Around the world there are around 1,200 different types of bat. So that's a lot of different types of bat. So all of the mammals in the world, if you think of all the cats and the dogs and the elephants and all things like that, bats make up 1/3 of them. So 1/3 of all of the mammals in the world are bats. And they live absolutely everywhere around the world, apart from the North and the South Poles. And the only reason they don't live in the North and the South Poles is there's no food there. So there's nothing for them to eat at the North and South Poles, but everywhere else there's something for them to eat, and they live there. So, now if we think about bats that live all around the world, not just in this country, what do we think bats might eat around the world? Well, insects, yeah, that's a good one. Fruit, yeah. Humans, ooh, we'll come on to that in a little bit. Insects, yeah. Animals, they do eat some animals, yeah. And then
Blood.
blood, yeah. And mice. I don't think they have mice. That's the one they don't eat. But if I start telling you what they do eat, so you've got some pictures here. So now we have this one here. This is a bat that eats fruit. And funnily enough, we call them a fruit bat. Yeah? Now, this bat here had a very special story. This bat had been caught up, unfortunately, where some people had been chopping down some trees and it had become injured. And the only thing that it wanted to do was hug that piece of watermelon. And it wouldn't let go of it. So that bat was taken in by some rescuers and looked after for a while, and then it was put back in the woods a bit later that year. And we also have this one here that's eating, what's this? Oh. We didn't have these boards when I was little, I'm not used to them. So what's this here?
What's eating?
A frog, yeah. And then this one here is eating a little bit like a hummingbird, and that's eating nectar. And then this one was eating blood, yes. Okay, so round the world they eat fruits, flowers, nectar, insects, fish, frogs, blood, and some bats even eat other bats. So they eat lots and lots of different things. Now, vampire bats. So who said that bats eat humans? That was you, wasn't it? Yeah. Now, unfortunately, there was a person quite a long time ago who wrote a story called Dracula. And what they said is that bats were really old grumpy men with big teeth that went round sucking people's blood. Now, I'm afraid that's not true.
Did you think that was true?
No.
Yeah, no.
I did.
Very clever.
You did, yeah. I'm afraid.
It's not really true.
No, it is a story, I'm afraid, but
Listen, Beaver.
I will tell you what is true. So, do you remember I said that there were 1,200 different types of bat around the world? Yeah? Well, that is true, but there's only 3 types of what we call vampire bat. So there's only 3 types, and I think they're quite cute, don't you? These are the vampire bats here, so they're not as scary as that grumpy old man, are they? No. Now, vampire bats are very special in the bat world, and they're very special because they're the only bats that really look after each other. So what they actually do is if one of the mum bats disappears or dies and there's a baby bat left, they will adopt the baby bat. And that's very rare in animals. That's not something other animals normally do because it's often hard to feed themselves. And they also will feed other bats as well. So if the bats have been out and they've managed to get lots to eat, and another bat hasn't managed to get lots to eat, they will feed the other bat. So they're very kind bats to each other. Now, they do eat blood, okay? Now we'll ask a question.
When the vampire bats get scared, do they turn into vampires?
No, they don't, I'm afraid. That's just in the films.
It's all made up. So.
Yeah, it's a very good story, but it is just a story, I'm afraid. So, how do we think vampire bats find their blood in the dark? If you imagine, now these bats as well, these bats are only about this big, yeah? So if you imagine they've got to find themselves some blood in the dark, how do you think they do that? Oh, they do get it from things, but how do they find the things that have blood?
It's dark out.
That's a very good answer, but it's not right in this case. Okay, I will answer that one in a second.
What they do it by feeding something if they feed a human,
They do it by feeling. Now, the first thing I will say is, again, this is very much part of the stories, these bats do not bite humans. They don't really like humans. I wouldn't like humans either. They probably taste quite bad. Especially with all the deodorants and things we use, we probably aren't very tasty anymore. But what they do is they do feel around, and these bats often crawl along the floor. But what they have that's really, really clever, in their noses up here, they have heat sensors. So has anybody ever seen what we call a thermal picture, where they use one of those cameras that shows what's warm and things, yeah? So these bats have those in their nose, and they will look for things that are warm in the dark. And if you think at night time it's quite cold, and what they do is they actually feed on cows and sometimes birds, but they don't really like people. So, and what they actually do is they find a cow, and they don't suck blood, they use a little claw and they just make a tiny scratch, and then they just lick. That's all they do, and then they fly off. So they don't suck blood, I'm afraid, but they do need blood to survive, and it tends to be cows. So, but they are very clever in the dark. They have big eyes, and then they have these heat sensors in their nose which helps them find their food, which I think is quite clever. So if we go into bats that are in this country, we've got 18 different types in this country, and again they make up quite a lot of our different animals that we have, but our bats are all quite small. So the smallest bat we have in this country is half the size of my thumb. So probably if you all hold up your thumbs, that's it. So let me see. Yeah, that's about right. So the smallest bat we have in this country is about the size of your thumb. That's how tiny they are. And it weighs the same as a pound coin. So next time you have a pound in your hand, you can hold that and think that weighs the same as our little bat that's called a pipistrelle, or some of us call them pips. A bit like what you get in an orange. And the biggest bat we have, which is what Rose is over there, is about this big. So she's not much bigger. She's not a very big bat, and she weighs about the same as 4 £2 coins. So still not a lot, not very big. But how big do you think the biggest bat in the world is? That big? Quite a close guess. Okay, we're getting bigger. We're getting bigger. Let's at the back there. Okay, we're going to have to go much, much bigger, I'm afraid. So if I, okay, that big, okay, and one more. That big, okay, right. I'm going to stand up. So the biggest bat in the world is this big. Yeah?
Is that the same size as you?
Yes. And it's, to be fair, I'm quite short, so the wings are probably even longer than me. If you imagine a tall man standing up doing this, that's how big the biggest bat is. So our bats in this country are really tiny when we think about it. And what do our bats eat? So somebody said this before, they eat insects. Lots and lots of different types of insects. So they eat midges and mosquitoes, flies, moths, spiders, beetles, lots of different things. And what we actually feed Rose on is we feed her on what are called mealworms. And you know how a caterpillar turns into a butterfly? Yeah? Well, a mealworm turns into a beetle. So it's a very similar thing, it's just not as pretty at the end. Now, where do they feed? Now, a few of you have said you've seen bats flying around, and lots of the time they fly over gardens. And they do like to fly over water, because anybody that's been out in summer, you see lots of bugs around water in summer. And often while you're outside in the middle of the night, can you see the insects flying above your heads? Yeah? Well, yeah, and that's what the bats like to eat. So sometimes you will see the bats flying around your head as well. And they quite like to eat in woodlands and over what we call grasslands, so where there's lots of fields and hedges, and also people's gardens. And they quite like gardens because often people put lots of fancy flowers in and make them look really pretty. So when you have lots of different flowers, you have lots of different insects, and that's what the bats like to eat. Now, bats live in lots of different places as well. So they can live in trees and in caves and also in buildings, especially really, you know when you see really old buildings with wonky roofs and things like that, bats really like those. And they also like bridges. And does anybody know Caversham around here? Near the river? Yeah? So down near Caversham you've got those big bridges that go across the river. And they have lots of bats living in them. And they all come out at night and they fly along the river and eat all the insects. Now, if anybody in here is like me, I get bitten by insects in summer a lot. I get lots of little bites all over my arms. And I quite like the bats because that's what the bats eat. So the more of those insects the bats eat, the less chance that I'm going to get bitten.
So they're helping us, aren't they?
Yeah.
Very helpful bats.
And we also have one here. I'll try not to touch the screen again. This one was found in a really old building, and you can see its little ears just poking out. And that one decided it was going to live behind some old paint, which was quite strange. It wasn't the nicest house in the world for it to live in, but it seemed quite happy. So, bats, they hang upside down. Now, often you'll see them in films hanging a bit like this, won't you, just by their 2 feet, yeah?
How do they hang up to?
Oh, we'll come on to that in a second. Very good question. So, bats will often hang upside down like this, but sometimes they have a little claw on their thumb, just here. And they will use that to grip onto sometimes as well, to stop themselves from moving around too much. But the reason that they hang by their feet, can anybody think of a reason why it's really important for bats to hang by their feet?
Stretch themselves?
To stretch themselves? Yeah, that's a good answer.
Stronger.
Yeah, definitely.
To make it easier for them to fly.
Perfect. Very good. I don't need to have any more answers. That's very good. If you think about where their wings are, if they were holding on with their wings, they wouldn't then be able to flap to be able to take off. So they hang on by their feet, so that all they have to do is open up their wings and fly away to go and find their food. Now bats have a really special thing in their feet. You know, when we want to grab onto something, you have to think about it and you have to grab on and hold on really tight. Well, what happens with bats is when they relax, their feet automatically go like that. So they don't have to think about it. So when they fall asleep, their feet automatically close and hold on really tight. So when they fall asleep, they can't accidentally fall off what they're holding on to. Because if they did that, they'd bump their heads, and that's not going to help them very much at all. So now we've had the answer to this question before. How do bats see in the dark? Now, who thinks here bats can see well? Oh. And who thinks bats are blind? Oh, half and half. So bats can actually see quite well. They are quite good at seeing, but people have told stories for quite a long time that bats are blind, because there's people say, oh, you're blind as a bat, and that's not true. But what is true is that bats can't see very well at night. It's a bit like us. If we turn the lights out, it becomes quite difficult to see. So what bats have done is they've learned to see in a very different way, and it's really, really clever. And not many animals can do this at all. And they use, to say the word again? Echolocation. So they use something we call echolocation. Now, it's very difficult to explain how echolocation works, but has anybody ever stood near a cave or near some big cliffs and they've shouted, hello? Yeah? And then you hear an echo come back, don't you? Like somebody else is there saying hello back to you. Yeah? So this is really what bats use. They shout using their mouths, and they shout really, really loud, although we normally can't hear it because it's at a level we can't hear. And what they do is they wait for that echo to come back, the noise to come back to them, and that tells them where things are. So they have a very special brain. When we hear that hello come back, all we know is that it's come back because there's an echo. But the bat's brain is really clever. It takes that echo and it works out how far away things are, what those things are, whether it's a tree or a building or an insect that they want to eat. And then they use that to help them fly around in the dark. So that is something really special that bats do, and we can't do very well at all. So, has this got sound on it?
Should work.
Okay, right, we'll try this, we'll see if it works. I've brought along some of the sounds that our different bats make. So the pipistrelle is our smallest bat. Let's see if this works. So that's the call the bat makes. Sounds like blowing a raspberry, doesn't it? Yeah. That's how we describe it when we're out and about. Yes, yes. And then he does that squeaking. So what he's doing there is all those different calls are him trying to work out where he needs to fly. Now we have another one. This one we think sounds a little bit more like fire. Can you listen to it? Anybody that's... Sounds like a crackling fire. No? Yeah, a little bit, yeah. Anybody that's got a fire at home? Yeah. And then this one, this one here is what this is the noise Rose would make if she was flying. Now these bats are much noisier and they fly over big areas, so they have a very different noise. Yes, it's a very different noise. Yeah. Now, Rose won't actually hear that noise because what we've done there is the noises bats normally make are normally really, really high pitched, so we can't normally hear them. But we've taken that and we've made it into a sound that we can hear properly. So Rose won't be able to hear that very well. She'll just think we're being strange out here. She won't think it's another bat. Okay, so just some of the reasons why I think we should all like bats. Firstly, they eat insects, so it means that we don't get bitten so much. But it also means that when you have farmers that grow things like fruit and vegetables for us to eat, they eat the insects that eat all of those things as well. So it means the farmers don't have to put many chemicals and things on their crops. They also pollinate a lot of our food. So anybody that eats things like mangoes or papayas, a lot of fruit that comes, things like bananas and things as well. Yeah. Bats pollinate a lot of those as well. And they also grow forests. So all of those fruit bats that eat all of that different fruit and things, as they fly through the forest and they leave their droppings everywhere, they turn into new trees. So without the bats, all the new trees and the new forests wouldn't grow. And they also help doctors develop medicines. So you know I said the vampire bat does a little scratch and then it licks the blood. Yeah. Well, what it does is as it licks that blood, it stops it from forming a scab. And what doctors have done is they've taken some vampire bat spit, sounds very technical, and they've turned it into a drug that can help people that have strokes. So when older people have something called a stroke, it can really affect their lives, and bats are helping older people as well. And also, bat poo is amazing. It's not very often we can say that, because lots of people use it on farms. It's very good for making plants grow. So in a lot of countries where you've got big caves that are full of lots and lots of bats, they go in and they dig out all of the droppings and they put it on the fields and it helps all of the crops grow. So it's very, very good for farmers. So now, I think you've all been particularly good. I think you've all been brilliant. So would you like to meet Rose?
Yes.
Okay.
Is that how she eats?
She looks similar to that, yes. She's maybe a little bit fatter because she doesn't fly so much. She doesn't get as much exercise. So Rose is what we call a nocturnal bat, and she's the biggest bat that we have in this country. Now, if Rose was flying around in the evening, she would be eating quite big beetles and moths. And she doesn't live in the wild. When she was a baby, she was found, and unfortunately she can't fly. So she's very happy doing what she does, but we wouldn't normally keep a bat in captivity. We wouldn't normally keep one if they can fly, because it's not good for them. But she can't fly, unfortunately, and she's quite happy doing what she does. So I will get her out, and if you can all sit quite quietly for me.
Nice and straight and quiet.
Could we make a row in the middle, and then I can make sure everybody sees it?
Would you want it if we went in like a circle and then?
That'd be better. Yeah.
No, quietly.